Before we start the story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. I needed this escape. After the year I'd had, peace was the only thing I craved. My ex-wife had taken the house, my boss had taken my sanity, and I was left holding nothing but a bag of resentment and a camera. So, here I was, finally alone in Black Rock Canyon, Joshua Tree's hauntingly beautiful desert. They said these nights were the darkest in the country, perfect for the long exposure shots I needed for my portfolio, but also, hopefully, for some much-needed clarity. The sky was ink black, spattered with a smattering of stars, and my RV felt like a fragile shell in this immense desert, which stretched out infinitely on all sides. I set up my tripod, thinking how strange it was to have so much space and yet feel the weight of something closing in, pressing down on me from every angle. I framed the shot, the rock formations jagged against the horizon, like bones clawing up from beneath the desert. Just as I clicked the shutter, something caught my eye. Something odd up on a nearby ridge. A pile of stones stacked in a rough tower stood silhouetted against the fading light. I squinted, unease prickling the back of my neck. It wasn't a cairn, at least not like the ones I'd seen before. These rocks were stacked too high and too precisely, almost ritualistic in their placement. And yet, I'd seen no one here. Not a soul for miles. I shook it off and went back to shooting. The night, with all its dark expansiveness, was settling in, and I was ready to forget everything. That's when I heard it. A low, humming sound reverberating through the thin air. It was faint, just a vibration, but I felt it in my bones. I stood still, listening, straining my ears as it grew louder, rhythmic, almost like a chant. I whipped around, expecting to find some desert animal or even another hiker. But there was nothing. Just the stacked stones up on the ridge, now looming in the moonlight, their shadows long and spindly like fingers stretching down toward me. "All right," I muttered, forcing a laugh. "Maybe you're just getting a little too comfortable out here." I forced myself back into the RV, telling myself it was just the wind, a desert echo, a trick of the open space. But that hum stuck with me, burrowing into my chest like a thorn I couldn't shake. I didn't think much more of it until the middle of the night, when I was jolted awake by a noise inside the RV, a clicking, snapping sound. My heart hammered as I sat up listening. Nothing. I climbed out of bed, checking the windows, and noticed my camera's light blinking. That's when I saw them. The pictures. They'd been taken while I was sleeping, distorted, blurry images of me lying in bed, the RV's dim interior barely illuminated. "What the?" I muttered, flipping through them, my mind scrambling for an explanation. There was no way I'd taken these. The only other option was that someone had been in here while I was asleep. My pulse raced, and I checked the door, feeling a wave of relief to find it locked. I told myself the camera was just malfunctioning, a faulty shutter maybe, but still, the hairs on my arms stood on end. In every photo, just beyond the frame, there was a shadow, a faint blur like someone was standing just out of sight. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone staring back at me, but there was nothing but the desert, empty and still. Reluctantly, I climbed back into bed, but sleep was out of the question. Every creak of the RV felt amplified in the silence, and I lay awake until the first light of dawn finally broke the tension. In the harsh light of morning, my nerves felt foolish. Determined to shake the feeling, I threw on my gear and hiked up to the ridge where I'd seen the stacked stones. The desert had that strange, quiet hum again, as if it were alive and breathing. The closer I got, the more stones I saw. They were everywhere, scattered across the sand, piled high, some forming a rough circle. At the center, I found something I hadn't expected. A rusted metal plaque half buried in the dirt, worn down but legible. I brushed the sand off, reading the words aloud, feeling the weight of each one. Do not disturb the desert's watchful ones. I swallowed, feeling an odd chill run through me. I'd read enough stories, heard enough lore to know that some things were better left alone. I made my way back to the RV, but that feeling of being watched clung to me. I was only a few feet from the door when I saw it, someone standing at the edge of the rocks staring down at me. My heart skipped. I called out, "Hello?" But there was no answer. They just stood there, perfectly still, a tall figure with shadowed features. I blinked, and they were gone. That night, I set up my camera again, trying to capture the stars, hoping to drown out the unease and work. But as the hours passed, the desert seemed to close in around me, and the silence grew almost deafening. Around midnight, the humming started again, that same low, droning chant. I shut my eyes, telling myself it was a desert sound, a trick of the wind. But when I opened my eyes, something shifted at the edge of my vision. There it was again, that shadowy figure, this time closer, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights, its features obscured but unmistakably human. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "Who are you?" I shouted, but it said nothing. It just stood there, silent, watching. I felt a chill seep into my bones as the figure slowly lifted a hand, pointing toward the ridge and the circle of stones. My mind screamed at me to stay in the RV, to lock the doors and wait for morning. But something inside me pushed back, a bitter voice whispering that I was here to face my demons, even if they were made of nothing more than shadow and sand. I stepped out of the RV, heart pounding, and aimed my flashlight toward the figure. But the light revealed nothing. The figure was gone. My camera kept snapping on its own, capturing photo after photo. I checked the screen, flipping through them with growing horror. The pictures showed me standing in front of the RV, but behind me, there was someone. A figure standing in the shadows, grinning, its face half-formed, almost human but twisted, as if made from sand and shadows. I stumbled back, fighting the instinct to run, and nearly tripped over the piled stones near the ridge. My breath was ragged, and I felt something cold brush against my neck, a whisper, low and distorted, echoing in the emptiness. "Ethan!" it hissed. I snapped. I hurled my camera toward the stones, smashing it on the rocks, hearing it shatter into pieces. I don't know why I did it, but something told me that's what it wanted. That whatever this thing was, it had fed off my memories, my photos, my presence. The desert was silent again. I felt it let go of me, the weight easing, and I staggered back to the RV, trembling, feeling a strange sense of loss and relief. I drove all night, the desert a blur of shadows in my rearview mirror, refusing to look back. But as dawn broke, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a peace I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what I'd seen, but I knew it was gone, left behind with the shattered pieces of my camera and whatever had haunted me for so long. Epilogue. Back home, weeks later, I found a package in the mail. No return address, no note, just a simple envelope. Inside was a single photo. It was one of my last shots from Black Rock Canyon, a photo of me asleep in the RV, peaceful, unaware. But in the corner of the image, a shadow hovered over me, its hand reaching out as if trying to pull something out of me, a piece of my soul, perhaps. And there, scrawled across the back of the photo, were 5 chilling words: "You will come back someday." I came to Allegheny National Forest to clear my head, to shut out the noise and rebuild myself. I'd had it all planned. A long weekend of solitude in the Pennsylvania wilderness, alone with my thoughts and maybe enough bourbon to forget the mistakes I'd made back home. The kind of reset a guy sometimes needs after losing everything. Setting up camp went smoothly enough. My RV was nestled in a secluded pocket deep within the trees, and by sunset I was settling in, trying to forget that it had only been a week since my divorce was finalized. If anyone had asked, I would have said I was here to embrace the solitude, to challenge myself. But if I'm honest, I came to avoid feeling like I'd been left behind. The forest around me was quiet, almost too quiet. No hum of civilization, no faint rumbles of cars. Just an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional bird call or the rustling of branches. But I told myself that's what I wanted: peace. On the first day, I'd spent hours hiking through the old-growth trails, letting the stillness absorb my thoughts. I met only one person, a guy named Randy, who I ran into as I turned a corner on a narrow trail. He looked about my age, tall, with a scruffy beard and a wide grin that said he was more than happy to have company. "Not many folks come out this far," he said, giving me a nod. "A guy like you, coming out here solo?" "Just getting away from things," I shrugged, not interested in diving into my personal life. But Randy's gaze stayed fixed on me, curious. "Well," he continued, "just be careful around these parts. Ever heard of the Hollow Men?" "The what?" I asked, laughing. This guy was clearly setting me up for some campfire story. "Spirits of miners," Randy explained, looking serious. "Died in a cave-in here back in the 1800s. They say they linger in these woods, hollow shells, trying to lure folks to their doom. Even some of the locals won't come out here alone." He must have seen my skeptical look because he chuckled, adding, "Laugh all you want, man. Just don't go answering voices out there, all right?" I waved him off with a smirk, but his words stuck with me as I continued down the trail. The silence of the forest, once comforting, now felt watchful, like something was waiting just beyond the trees. That night, I sat by my RV, staring up at the stars that looked almost unnatural in their brightness against the dark, empty sky. I poured myself a drink, willing myself to shake off Randy's ghost stories, to just focus on the calm, on the stillness of the place. But the peace didn't come. Instead, there was a strange rhythmic sound echoing through the woods, like the distant tapping of metal against rock. It was faint, almost like an echo. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of old machinery, an oddity, but not impossible in a place like this. Still, it sent a chill through me, prickling the hairs on my arms. By the time I made it inside the RV, I was brushing off the noise as my imagination. But that's when I noticed something even stranger. My pocket knife was gone. It had been right there, on the countertop where I'd left it after dinner. But now it was nowhere to be found. I checked my pockets, the table, even the floor, but it had vanished. I tried to shake off a growing sense of unease, telling myself I'd just misplaced it. but the feeling stayed with me, settling into my bones as I lay in bed that night, listening to the stillness around me. Just when I was on the verge of sleep, a quiet, subtle scratching sound echoed through the RV. My heart stopped as I lay frozen, straining to listen. Nothing. It was only the wind, I told myself. But that night, my dreams were filled with shadows shifting in the trees, voices whispering my name. The next day was more of the same. I explored deeper into the forest, and the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. I started hearing faint whispers just outside my line of sight, always when I was least expecting it. They were soft and quick, like a conversation I wasn't meant to hear, or someone calling out, trying to get my attention. When I stopped to listen, though, they were gone, and I'd be left alone with only the beating of my heart to keep me company. The worst was that fog. Sometime after midday, a strange, heavy fog rolled in, blanketing the forest in a dense gray haze. It felt like something out of a horror movie, obscuring the trails, making even familiar paths seem foreign and confusing. I tried to find my way back to camp, but every trail looked the same, winding in endless loops. By the time I finally stumbled into my campsite, I felt more disoriented than ever, as if I'd somehow crossed a boundary into a different world. That night, I heard it again, the rhythmic banging, louder this time, like the echoes of old mining tools. I sat in the RV, clutching a flashlight, the noise reverberating through my mind until I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know what was making that sound. The forest was alive in a way I'd never experienced before. Each shadow, each twist of a branch seeming to watch me, follow me. The sound led me deeper into the woods, my flashlight beam barely cutting through the thick fog that seemed to grow denser with every step. And then I saw them. Figures barely visible through the haze. They were human shapes, no doubt about it, but hollow, like shadows cast against a wall. They moved in slow, shuffling steps, and as I got closer, I realized they weren't walking. They were mining. Hands held picks that struck the ground rhythmically, echoing through the trees. "Hey!" I called out before I could think twice. Every head snapped up at once, a dozen hollow eyes turning toward me, empty and lifeless. My breath caught in my throat as I realized these weren't people. They weren't anything close to people. I stumbled backward, heart racing, the figures closing in. As I turned to run, I heard a voice calling my name, a voice that sounded all too familiar. "Logan! Logan!" It was Randy's voice, coming from somewhere beyond the shadows. I felt an instinctive pull, a need to answer him, to follow the voice. But I couldn't shake the memory of his warning. "Don't go answering voices out there." I kept running, the voice following me, calling, pleading, until I was back at the RV. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, my breath coming in gasps as I stared out into the darkness. The hollow men lingered at the edge of the clearing, their eyes fixed on me, watching, waiting. I sat in the RV, every nerve on edge, wondering if they'd try to get inside. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft scrape of fingers, or claws, against the outside walls. I was trapped, completely trapped. Suddenly, I remembered Randy's words about the miners, that they'd died trapped, unable to move forward or back. They were stuck in the same place, forever lost, cursed to haunt the forest. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to stop, to not resist, to not fight. I closed my eyes, repeating words I barely knew. just staying still, hoping the hollow men would lose interest. My hands shook, my breaths coming in short bursts, but I refused to run, to move. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow. Gradually, the sounds faded, the scratching growing softer, until finally, there was silence. I opened my eyes, heart still racing, and peered out the window. The figures were gone, swallowed back into the fog. I didn't waste a second. Fumbling with the keys, I started the RV, heart pounding as I floored it, heading down the dirt road without looking back. The fog seemed to thin as I drove, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest with every mile I put between myself and the hollow woods. The next morning, I found myself parked at a gas station just outside of Allegheny, hands still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I wasn't sure what I'd seen, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back. Inside the gas station, I overheard two locals talking about a camper who'd vanished out in Allegheny's woods the week before. The police had called it an accident, but the locals, they spoke in whispers, muttering about the hollow men, the restless spirits waiting for the next lost soul to join them. As I left the station, I felt a familiar chill. Maybe it was just my nerves, or maybe it was them, watching me from the shadows. I needed this escape. After the year I'd had, peace was the only thing I craved. My ex-wife had taken the house, my boss had taken my sanity, and I was left holding nothing but a bag of resentment and a camera. So, here I was, finally alone in Black Rock Canyon, Joshua Tree's hauntingly beautiful desert. They said these nights were the darkest in the country, perfect for the long exposure shots I needed for my portfolio, but also, hopefully, for some much-needed clarity. The sky was ink black, spattered with a smattering of stars, and my RV felt like a fragile shell in this immense desert, which stretched out infinitely on all sides. I set up my tripod, thinking how strange it was to have so much space and yet feel the weight of something closing in, pressing down on me from every angle. I framed the shot, the rock formations jagged against the horizon, like bones clawing up from beneath the desert. Just as I clicked the shutter, something caught my eye. Something odd, up on a nearby ridge. A pile of stones stacked in a rough tower stood silhouetted against the fading light. I squinted, unease prickling the back of my neck. It wasn't a cairn, at least not like the ones I'd seen before. These rocks were stacked too high and too precisely, almost ritualistic in their placement. And yet, I'd seen no one here. Not a soul for miles. I shook it off and went back to shooting. The night, with all its dark expansiveness, was settling in, and I was ready to forget everything. That's when I heard it. A low, humming sound reverberating through the thin air. It was faint, just a vibration, but I felt it in my bones. I stood still, listening, straining my ears as it grew louder, rhythmic, almost like a chant. I whipped around, expecting to find some desert animal or even another hiker. But there was nothing, just the stacked stones up on the ridge, now looming in the moonlight, their shadows long and spindly like fingers stretching down toward me. "All right," I muttered, forcing a laugh. "Maybe you're just getting a little too comfortable out here." I forced myself back into the RV, telling myself it was just the wind, a desert echo, a trick of the open space. But that hum stuck with me, burrowing into my chest like a thorn I couldn't shake. I didn't think much more of it until the middle of the night when I was jolted awake by a noise inside the RV, a clicking, snapping sound. My heart hammered as I sat up listening. Nothing. I climbed out of bed, checking the windows, and noticed my camera's light blinked. That's when I saw them, the pictures. They'd been taken while I was sleeping, distorted, blurry images of me lying in bed, the RV's dim interior barely illuminated. "What the?" I muttered, flipping through them, my mind scrambling for an explanation. There was no way I'd taken these. The only other option was that someone had been in here while I was asleep. My pulse raced and I checked the door, feeling a wave of relief to find it locked. I told myself the camera was just malfunctioning, a faulty shutter maybe, but still, the hairs on my arm stood on end. In every photo, just beyond the frame, there was a shadow, a faint blur, like someone was standing just out of sight. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone staring back at me, but there was nothing but the desert, empty and still. Reluctantly, I climbed back into bed, but sleep was out of the question. Every creak of the RV felt amplified in the silence, and I lay awake until the first light of dawn finally broke the tension. In the harsh light of morning, my nerves felt foolish. Determined to shake the feeling, I threw on my gear and hiked up to the ridge where I'd seen the stacked stones. The desert had that strange, quiet hum again, as if it were alive and breathing. The closer I got, the more stones I saw. They were everywhere, scattered across the sand, piled high, some forming a rough circle. At the center, I found something I hadn't expected. A rusted metal plaque half buried in the dirt, worn down but legible. I brushed the sand off, reading the words aloud, feeling the weight of each one. "Do not disturb the desert's watchful ones." I swallowed, feeling an odd chill run through me. I'd read enough stories, heard enough lore, to know that some things were better left alone. I made my way back to the RV, but that feeling of being watched clung to me. I was only a few feet from the door when I saw it. Someone standing at the edge of the rocks, staring down at me. My heart skipped. I called out, "Hello?" But there was no answer. They just stood there, perfectly still, a tall figure with shadowed features. I blinked, and they were gone. That night, I set up my camera again, trying to capture the stars, hoping to drown out the unease and work. But as the hours passed, the desert seemed to close in around me, and the silence grew almost deafening. Around midnight, the humming started again, that same low, droning chant. I shut my eyes, telling myself it was a desert sound, a trick of the wind. But when I opened my eyes, something shifted at the edge of my vision. There it was again, that shadowy figure, this time closer, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights, its features obscured but unmistakably human. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "Who are you?" I shouted, but it said nothing. It just stood there, silent, watching. I felt a chill seep into my bones as the figure slowly lifted a hand, pointing toward the ridge and the circle of stones. My mind screamed at me to stay in the RV, to lock the doors and wait for morning. But something inside me pushed back, a bitter voice whispering that I was here to face my demons, even if they were made of nothing more than shadow and sand. I stepped out of the RV, heart pounding, and aimed my flashlight toward the figure. But the light revealed nothing. The figure was gone. My camera kept snapping on its own, capturing photo after photo. I checked the screen, flipping through them with growing horror. The pictures showed me standing in front of the RV, but behind me there was someone. A figure standing in the shadows, grinning, its face half-formed, almost human but twisted, as if made from sand and shadows. I stumbled back, fighting the instinct to run, and nearly tripped over the piled stones near the ridge. My breath was ragged, and I felt something cold brush against my neck, a whisper, low and distorted, echoing in the emptiness. "Ethan," it hissed. I snapped. I hurled my camera toward the stones, smashing it on the rocks, hearing it shatter into pieces. I don't know why I did it, but something told me that's what it wanted, that whatever this thing was, it had fed off my memories, my photos, my presence. The desert was silent again. I felt it let go of me, the weight easing, and I staggered back to the RV, trembling, feeling a strange sense of loss and relief. I drove all night, the desert a blur of shadows in my rearview mirror, refusing to look back. But as dawn broke, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a peace I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what I'd seen, but I knew it was gone, left behind with the shattered pieces of my camera and whatever had haunted me for so long. Epilogue. Back home, weeks later, I found a package in the mail. No return address, no note, just a simple envelope. Inside was a single photo. It was one of my last shots from Black Rock Canyon, a photo of me asleep in the RV, peaceful, unaware. But in the corner of the image, a shadow hovered over me, its hand reaching out, as if trying to pull something out of me, a piece of my soul, perhaps. And there, scrawled across the back of the photo, were 5 chilling words: "You will come back someday." If you'd told me a week ago that I'd be clutching my best friend's arm, hiding from a shadow creature in the Utah desert, I'd have laughed. That's the sort of stuff reserved for ghost stories told around a campfire, right? But now, as I crouch low in the sand, staring at the shadow shifting through the rocks like smoke, the chill in my spine tells me I was wrong. Tyler and I had been planning this trip for ages. It was supposed to be a break from our relentless lives back in San Francisco. When my promotion came through, I convinced him we had to celebrate by camping across the Southwest, ticking off bucket list spots along the way. Dead Horse Point was the prize, the place I'd looked forward to the most. Its isolation, haunting beauty, and honestly a reputation for eerie legends that I couldn't resist. We pulled in late, just as the sun was setting over the canyon, casting a blood-red glow across the twisted rock formations. I remember that unease settled over me then, the kind that sends a tiny shiver from the back of your neck all the way down. Tyler, ever the skeptic, brushed it off as I pointed out we were alone in this remote part of the park. "Great. More room for us," he joked, snapping photos of the stunning desert horizon. It took us a bit longer to find a spot than we'd planned. Our GPS was acting weird, leading us down dirt trails that seemed to spiral into nowhere. Eventually, Tyler managed to maneuver our RV into a flat area, not ideal but secluded and scenic. "Perfect," he'd said. I wasn't so sure. When we finally set up camp, the daylight had faded, leaving us bathed in the cold blue of twilight. I fiddled with our old portable radio, hoping to get some music to fill the silence, but the thing just crackled static before sputtering and dying altogether. Tyler laughed, but I caught the way his eyes darted around the empty landscape. It felt almost oppressive, the way the land seemed to watch us. "You and that ghost-loving imagination," Tyler teased, rummaging through his bag. "Maybe it's a sign, or just Utah's finest weather." "Ha ha, very funny," I replied, forcing a laugh. "But this place has stories, Ty. Have you heard of the Skinwalker?" "The what?" he chuckled, turning to face me. "Mia, are you seriously bringing up ghost stories?" "Not Ghosts exactly, I said, trying to hide how uneasy I felt. Skinwalkers are shapeshifters in Navajo legends. They can mimic people, even voices, to lure you away. People say they're evil spirits in human or animal form. Tyler looked at me with that familiar, infuriating smirk. Oh yeah? Then let's summon one. Here, Skinwalker, Skinwalker, show yourself. I hissed for him to stop, but he just laughed and returned to the viewfinder on his camera, snapping photos of the canyon now fully cloaked in darkness. I closed the RV door, hoping to shut out the chill that had suddenly settled into my bones. But that shiver, that sense of being watched, it lingered. It was maybe an hour later when the first sound came. A light, shuffling sound outside like footsteps in the gravel. My heart skipped and I shot Tyler a look, but he was already putting on a brave face, pulling his boots on to investigate. It's probably an animal, he whispered, winking. Mountain lions, right? Yeah, 'cause mountain lions sound like people, I said, my voice barely a breath. He ignored me, clicking on his flashlight and stepping out. It was quiet, eerily so. Tyler scanned the flashlight across the rocks, the beam casting long shadows. For a moment, I was almost convinced he was right, that we were just being paranoid in the strange silence of the desert. But then we heard it, a whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. Mia, Mia. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was scratchy and low, calling my name. I whipped around to face Tyler, but he was frozen. His face drained of color as the voice echoed again. Did you... I stammered, trying to find the words. Tyler didn't answer. He just stared. Flashlight clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. Mia, Mia. This time, the voice seemed closer, as if it were slipping between the rocks, winding its way through the desert toward us. It sounded familiar, too familiar, but wrong. Let's go inside, I whispered. Tyler nodded, and we backed up slowly, not turning our backs on the emptiness around us. Once inside, I locked the door, our breaths rapid in the tight space. Tyler finally spoke, his voice shaking. Tell me that was just the wind. I don't think so, I replied, glancing out the window. The night was still, an unnatural stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Just as I was starting to feel a little less tense, there was a sharp knock on the side of the RV. We both froze. Another knock, then another, rhythmic, echoing through the metal walls. Tyler's face paled and I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my throat. Who's there? He called, voice wavering. The only answer was a slow scrape against the door, a sound that made my skin crawl. I squeezed Tyler's arm. Don't open it. What if someone's hurt? He whispered back, already inching toward the door. But I couldn't shake the feeling that opening that door would be the worst thing we could do. Just wait. And then, to our horror, we heard Tyler's voice calling from outside. Tyler, help, come out here. Tyler looked at me, eyes wide with terror. What? How? He stammered. The voice repeated, distorted, stretching his name into a twisted mockery. Dear Lear. I grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. Don't answer. Whatever you do, don't answer it. The minutes dragged by, each second stretching into eternity as the voice continued calling, beckoning us. Tyler and I stayed as still as statues, clutching each other, the silence in the RV thick and heavy. Finally, the knocking stopped, and for a moment, all was quiet. But just when I started to breathe again, the RV rocked violently, as though something massive had slammed into it. Tyler scrambled to the driver's seat, twisting the keys to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. He tried again and again, but nothing. The shape outside pressed itself against the window, casting an elongated, inhuman shadow. It had limbs too long, eyes that glowed with a sickly yellow light. Its mouth was twisted, an eerie mimicry of a smile that seemed to stretch too far. "Oh my God, Mia," Tyler gasped, clutching the steering wheel, white-knuckled. "Mia," the creature hissed, its voice a blend of my own and Tyler's, distorted, mocking. "Come outside." I shook my head, my voice trembling. "Don't look at it. Don't listen to it." But it was too late. Tyler couldn't tear his gaze away from that awful face in the window, his breath hitching as the creature's mouth stretched impossibly wide. Suddenly, he screamed, clutching his ears as if to block out the sound. I pulled him away, whispering words I barely remembered from some article on Navajo blessings, words I didn't even know if I was pronouncing right. But as I spoke, the creature seemed to pause, tilting its head in confusion, almost weakened. Seizing my chance, I dragged Tyler out of his stupor, and together we stumbled out of the RV. The creature's eyes followed us, glowing like embers as we bolted toward a narrow crevice in the rocks. I held Tyler tight as we crouched in the shadows, watching the thing stalk around our RV, frustrated, snarling. It hissed again, a guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Mia, Tyler, you can't hide." Tyler's hand was clammy in mine, his breath shallow. "Mia, what is that thing?" "A skinwalker," I whispered, my voice barely audible. It's feeding off our fear." Tyler squeezed my hand tighter. "What do we do?" "We stay quiet and don't look it in the eyes," I murmured, remembering the warning. "We wait." Time seemed to slow. The skinwalker circled the rocks, searching, stalking, its low growl echoing off the stone. At one point, it stopped, sniffing the air, its gaze passing right over us, so close I could see the rotting skin around its eyes. We held our breaths, not daring to move. Slowly, the creature slunk away, disappearing into the shadows. The silence stretched on, each second a lifetime. Eventually, we crept back to the RV, praying the creature had gone. Tyler tried the engine again, and, miraculously, it roared to life. Without a second thought, we sped down the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness as we left Dead Horse Point behind. By morning, we were back in Moab, dazed, exhausted, and shaken beyond belief. Tyler's arm was bleeding from where the creature had scratched him, and I had bruises from gripping him too tightly. We warned other campers, but no one believed us. Later, as I lay awake in the safety of a crowded campsite, I could still hear it, whispering my name on the wind, lingering in the corners of my mind. Maybe it was waiting, or maybe it was just saying goodbye. Until next time. My legs were sore, and I could feel the sweat drying on my skin, chilling me in the early evening air as I fell flop down beside the fire we'd just managed to coax to life. We were miles away from the main campgrounds, deep in Joshua Tree's endless desert, a decision that had seemed thrilling earlier in the day. But now that the sun was dipping below the horizon, washing the landscape in shades of deep red and purple, I felt a twinge of uncertainty prickling at the back of my neck. It was my idea, of course. I wanted the adventure, the isolation, the strange beauty of the desert at night. The three of us, my boyfriend, Alex, my best friend, Brianna, and her boyfriend Jared had all agreed to come out to this spot after some careful convincing on my part. We'd spent the day exploring the hidden trails, taking pictures, and climbing the rocky outcroppings that dotted the vast desert. But now, as darkness settled in, I found myself regretting the distance we'd put between ourselves and any other campers. I shifted closer to Alex, trying to ignore my nerves. Brianna sat across from me, her eyes darting nervously at the shadows pooling between the rocks around us. She'd never been thrilled about camping so far from civilization, but she'd gone along with it for my sake. Jared, on the other hand, was his usual laid-back self, poking at the fire with a stick. He kept glancing at Brianna and then back at me, his playful grin not quite masking his own unease. "Is this a bad time to mention my tent's busted?" Alex muttered, inspecting a rip along the seam. I groaned. "Seriously? You didn't check before we left?" He shrugged, throwing a lopsided smile my way. "I'm a live-in-the-moment kind of guy. We'll all fit in one tent, right?" "I guess we don't have much choice," Brianna said, shooting me a worried glance. "Let's just hope we all survive the night." Jared laughed, a little too loudly. "Come on, Bri. It's not like anything's going to happen out here. It's just us and the desert." But Brianna's eyes hadn't left the encroaching shadows, and I could feel the tightness in her voice. "Yeah, well, that's what they say in every horror movie right before things get bad." The fire crackled as we fell silent, each of us staring into the flames, the familiar rhythm of camping. Jokes, stories, laughter, somehow absent tonight. Instead, an uneasy quiet took its place, filling the spaces between us like a cold mist. Even Jared had stopped laughing. He looked up at the darkening sky, his face shadowed in the firelight, and for a moment, I thought he looked genuinely spooked. Just then, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like something knocking against rock, far out in the desert. I glanced at Alex, who was listening too, his brow furrowed. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his voice held a note of doubt. Brianna's eyes darted to mine. "Do you guys hear that?" Jared scoffed, but he didn't sound as confident as usual. "It's just the rocks shifting, or animals or something." "Animals that tap?" Brianna asked, her tone sarcastic but with an edge of genuine fear. Alex put a reassuring arm around me, but I could feel the tension in his grip. "Let's just settle in, okay? It's nothing." I nodded, forcing myself to believe him, even though the tapping hadn't stopped. It was steady, too steady, like the beat of a slow drum. Each time it faded into the silence, I could feel a tightness in my chest, an instinctual alarm I couldn't shake. I glanced up at the jagged rocks surrounding our campsite, half expecting to see a figure standing there. But there was nothing, just shadows, deeper and darker than the night itself. Brianna whispered, "I heard this story once about this thing that lives out here. They call it the Yucca Man." I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Oh, great, Brianna. Perfect story for a night like this." She looked at me seriously. "They say he's like a guardian spirit of the desert. Tall, with eyes that glow in the dark. Supposedly, he watches over Joshua Tree and doesn't like it when people get too close, especially if they wander off the main trails." Alex rolled his eyes. "And what, he just taps rocks to scare us off?" Brianna shrugged, but her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know. Maybe he's just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Jared scoffed, though his bravado was wearing thin. Before she could answer, Alex stood up and grabbed his flashlight, shining it across the rocks. I watched as the beam illuminated the stark, twisted shapes of the Joshua trees, their shadows stretching and warping across the sand. Just as he moved the light, I saw it, a tall, dark shape standing motionless against the rocks. My heart stopped and I felt Alex's grip on my hand tighten. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. The figure was gone as quickly as it had appeared, blending back into the darkness. Jared laughed nervously, breaking the tension. "It's probably just a shadow, guys. You're all wound up for nothing." But even Jared didn't sound convinced. He picked up his flashlight, swinging it around as if he could somehow erase the eerie image from our minds. The tapping had stopped, leaving a thick, oppressive silence in its place. Brianna's voice was small. "Can we just go back?" Alex shook his head, even though his face was pale. "No way. We came all this way. We're just letting our imaginations get the best of us." But I wasn't so sure. The feeling in the air was different now, like we weren't alone, like there was something ancient and unseen watching us. I looked out into the darkness, straining my eyes for any sign of movement. My gaze landed on a rock nearby, where strange symbols were scratched into the surface, intricate spirals and jagged lines. I hadn't noticed them before. "Guys, come look at this," I whispered, beckoning them over. They all gathered around, staring at the markings. Brianna looked unnerved, and even Jared's face was grim. "Looks like old petroglyphs," Alex muttered, though his voice lacked confidence. "Probably left by Native Americans or something." Brianna shook her head. "These aren't like any petroglyphs I've seen." We stared in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on us. I could feel something shift in the air, a dark, lurking presence just beyond our understanding. It was like the symbols were meant as a warning, and we were trespassing on something sacred. Then the tapping began again. This time it was louder, closer. My heart raced as I looked around, the shadows seeming to close in on us. Suddenly, Brianna screamed, pointing to the rocks. The figure was back, closer this time. A tall, thin shadow with eyes that gleamed faintly in the firelight. It watched us, unblinking, its gaze cold and penetrating. Jared stumbled back, his bravado gone. "What the hell is that?" Alex grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the tent. "Get inside. Now." We all scrambled into the tent, zipping it up in a frenzy. The fire outside flickered, casting an eerie glow on the tent walls, making our shadows dance. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, and I tried to quiet it, listening for any sound outside. We sat in silence, huddled together, straining our ears for any sign of movement. For a few moments, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a low, whispering voice calling my name. My blood ran cold and I felt Alex stiffen beside me. "Mia!" It was my own voice coming from outside the tent. I clutched Alex's arm, trying to keep myself calm, but inside I was shaken. The voice grew louder, and then I heard Alex's name, then Brianna's, then Jared's. It was like it knew us, like it was calling us out one by one. "Don't listen to it," Alex whispered, his voice shaken. "It's just trying to scare us." But the voice persisted, repeating our names over and over, a haunting chant that made my skin crawl. I could feel the fear thick in the air, an almost tangible weight pressing down on us. Suddenly, the voice stopped, replaced by a scratching sound like nails dragging against the fabric of the tent. I held my breath, frozen in place as the scratching moved along the walls, circling us slowly. My mind was racing, searching for any way out, any escape. Brianna was crying quietly, her head buried in Jared's shoulder, and Jared held her tight, his face pale and drawn. I could feel Alex trembling beside me, his usual confidence replaced by raw fear. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the scratching stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my body tense and ready to bolt. We need to leave," I whispered. Alex nodded, his face set with determination. "We're going, now." We gathered our things as quickly as we could, stumbling out of the tent and into the cold desert night. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint glow to guide us. I looked around, half expecting to see the figure waiting for us, but the desert was empty. We started moving, our steps fast and panicked, our flashlights sweeping over the rocks as we tried to find the trail. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, certain I would see it following us, but there was nothing. Only the still, oppressive silence of the desert. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the trailhead, our car waiting just where we'd left it. We piled in, slamming the doors, and Alex started the engine, speeding down the dirt road without looking back. As we drove away, I glanced out the window, and for a brief moment, I saw it. The tall, dark figure standing on the edge of the rocks, watching us as we left its territory. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, a silent warning, a promise that we would not be welcome if we ever dared to return. I didn't look back again. None of us spoke the entire way home. But that night, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear it, the rhythmic tapping, the whisper of my name, the feeling of something watching, waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. And I knew that a part of the desert had come back with me, a silent shadow that would haunt me, watching forever. The fog was starting to roll in, thickening over the glassy surface of Lake Superior, swallowing up what was left of the sunset. I'd come out here alone, just me and my RV, parked in one of the remote pull-offs along the shore of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It was the perfect setting for my latest project, a short documentary on the eerie legends surrounding this massive lake. Lake Superior had more than its share of ghost stories, some dating back centuries, and one shipwreck that always sent chills down my spine. The SS Bannockburn, which vanished without a trace in 1902, along with all of its crew. Locals called it the Flying Dutchman of the Great Lakes. And if you believe the legends, the ship was still out there, prowling the lake in the fog, filled with ghostly sailors who'd never found peace. It was just a story. A great story, but just that. I'd never been the type to believe in ghosts. I came to document myths, not get caught up in them, but sitting there, watching the fog thicken over the lake like a shroud, I started to feel uneasy. I set up my camera on the shore and adjusted the lens, focusing on the water. The last rays of light were fading fast, and soon the lake was almost completely swallowed by darkness. Then, just at the edge of my vision, I saw a small glimmer of light flickering out on the water. My pulse quickened. Probably just a boat, I told myself, or campers across the lake. The light swayed back and forth, bobbing gently on the waves, almost like a lantern. I zoomed in, adjusting the focus, but the fog distorted everything. The light vanished for a moment, then reappeared farther down the shore, closer than before. "Luke, you're just tired," I muttered, shaking my head. I packed up my camera and headed back to the RV, locking up tight before settling into bed. But the image of that light lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something I shouldn't have. Just a trick of the light, I told myself again, but my heart didn't seem to agree. I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke up to the sound of faint, rhythmic splashes. The clock on the wall glowed 3:12 a.m., and I could still see the lake out of the small window beside my bed. Moonlight was piercing through the fog, casting an eerie glow over the water, where ripples were spreading out, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. I held my breath, watching the water. The splashing had stopped, leaving the lake completely still, but in the quiet, I thought I heard something else, a faint metallic clang, like the tolling of a ship's bell. My chest tightened. It couldn't be. The Bannock burn was just a legend, a story people told to scare themselves. But as I lay there, every hair on my body standing on end, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I stayed still for what felt like hours, barely daring to breathe, until finally the fog seemed to thicken, blanketing the lake and blotting out the moon. With the night plunged back into darkness, I closed my eyes, forcing myself back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early and ventured out to the shoreline with my camera, hoping to catch the sunrise. But when I stepped outside, something stopped me dead in my tracks. Footprints. Bare, muddy footprints trailing from the lake right up to the door of my RV. I took a step back, my mind racing. The prints were fresh, the sand still damp. I snapped a photo, trying to keep my hands steady, but my mind was screaming at me to get out of there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, had come ashore in the middle of the night. "Relax, Luke," I muttered, forcing myself to breathe. "It's just a prank. Some local kids messing around." But as I looked down at the footprints, I noticed they weren't like any I'd seen before. They were long and narrow, almost inhuman, and there was no sign of whoever, or whatever, had left them. I spent the day filming footage of the lake and trying to ignore the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. But when night fell, the fog returned, thicker than before, swallowing up the shore in a blanket of mist. The lake was barely visible now, just a dark shape beneath the pale fog. I forced myself to focus on editing footage, trying to ignore the shadows shifting outside my window. But then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The faint tolling of a ship's bell coming from the lake. The same slow, mournful sound I'd heard the night before. I stood up, my heart pounding, and peeked out the window. The fog was so thick I could barely see anything, but then I spotted a faint light bobbing on the water, just like before. I grabbed my camera, stepped outside, and started filming, ignoring the icy wind cutting through my jacket. The light was closer now, and I could make out a shape beneath it, something tall and dark looming over the water. It looked like a figure, standing just at the edge of the lake. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was real. The figure was watching me, standing completely still as the fog swirled around it. And as I watched, it started moving, gliding across the water toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and bolted back to the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it tight. My hands were shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. I peeked out the window, but the figure had vanished. The fog was thicker now, pressing up against the glass, and I felt like I was suffocating. I sank onto the bed, my heart pounding. This was insane. There was no way this was happening. The Bannock burn was a myth, just a story. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to, what? Listen? Leave? Or maybe something worse? Desperate for answers, I pulled out my laptop and began searching for anything I could find on the Bannock Burn and its crew. As I scrolled through old newspaper clippings and forgotten forums, I found one name that kept popping up. A young sailor named Thomas Gray, who was on the Bannock Burn's final voyage. According to the records, Thomas had left behind a fiancée in Sault Ste. Marie, and it was rumored he'd been desperate to get back to her. The locals said his ghost haunted the lake, searching for someone to carry his final message. The cabin lights flickered, and my screen glitched, freezing on a grainy black and white photo of Thomas Gray. He was young, with piercing eyes that seemed to stare right through the screen. A chill crept over me as I realized the face in the photo looked exactly like the figure I'd seen on the lake. Just then, a gust of wind rattled the RV, and I heard the faintest whisper, barely audible over the creaking of the metal. "Please, take it to her." My blood turned to ice. The voice was soft, pleading, filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I looked around, but the RV was empty. I was alone. Or was I? I scrambled back to the laptop, searching for any mention of the message Thomas Gray had wanted to deliver. But as I scrolled through article after article, the same words appeared over and over. "She'll never know." The lights flickered again, and I felt the air grow heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The voice was louder now, echoing through the RV. "She'll never know. Please, take it to her." I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice grew louder, filling my mind with images of stormy waters, the creak of a ship's mast, and the hollow eyes of Thomas Gray staring back at me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my camera, burst out of the RV, and ran to the edge of the lake, the fog swallowing me up. The water was still, unnaturally calm, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. I felt the weight of the camera in my hand and held it up, pointing it toward the lake. "If you want me to deliver your message," I shouted, my voice trembling, "then show me. Tell me what to say." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the fog, standing at the water's edge. It was Thomas Gray, his eyes hollow and filled with an unfathomable sorrow. He stared at me as if seeing right through me and raised one hand, pointing to a spot on the shore. I followed his gaze and saw a piece of driftwood, its surface smooth and polished, with a message scrawled in the sand beneath it. "Tell her I loved her. Tell her I tried to come back." I felt tears sting my eyes as I read the words, the weight of Thomas's sorrow pressing down on me. I took a deep breath, picked up the driftwood, and held it out toward the figure. "Is this what you wanted?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure nodded slowly, a look of relief washing over his face, and then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, swallowed up by the fog. I stood there, the driftwood clutched in my hand, feeling the weight of a century-old sorrow lift from my shoulders. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I left the driftwood at the edge of the shore a silent memorial to the lost crew of the Bannock Burn. I packed up the RV and drove away, leaving Lake Superior and its ghost behind. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of me had stayed behind on that lonely shore, bound to the lake and its secrets. And every now and then, when the fog rolls in and the night grows quiet, I hear the faint tolling of a ship's bell, a reminder of the message I delivered for a ghostly sailor who would never return. The Smoky Mountains were supposed to be a kind of therapy, a solo reset that I'd been telling myself I needed. My old job as a park ranger was behind me, and now I was out here in my RV, parked at a secluded campground in the middle of nowhere, looking to find a little peace, maybe even reclaim some confidence. These mountains weren't new to me, but there was something about being out here alone that added a layer of tension I couldn't quite shake. After pulling off onto a barely used, uneven path, I set up camp, breathing in the dense, cool air. Fog hung over the campsite, sinking low among the trees, but the solitude felt oddly comforting. That evening, as I sat by the fire with a mug of instant coffee, an old park ranger had passed by, out checking the area. "Don't go too deep into the trails around here after dusk," he warned, his face serious under his worn cap. "Folks talk about a watcher in these parts. It doesn't like company." I laughed it off, but the ranger didn't smile. He gave me one last measuring look before he left, disappearing into the shadows with a casual wave. Alone again, I shrugged off his words. The Smokies were full of ghost stories and folk tales, stories passed around the campfires and whispered to tourists. I'd spent years working out in the wilderness and hadn't seen anything I couldn't explain. But as the night wore on, my confidence began to falter. I was sitting in my fold-up chair, camera at my side, when I heard it. Faint footsteps, the crunch of leaves not far from my RV. I tensed, staring into the thick darkness where the fire's glow didn't reach. The forest was silent again, the sound gone as quickly as it had come. I glanced at my camera, tempted to try capturing whatever it was, but I couldn't see anything. It was probably just an animal, I told myself, or maybe the wind shaking branches. But the quiet felt wrong. Too still, as if the forest itself was waiting, listening. I shivered, threw another log on the fire, and stayed close to its warmth until I finally retreated to the RV. The next morning, I went out to inspect the area around my camp. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but the sound of footsteps from the night before had lingered in my mind, making sleep restless and shallow. That's when I saw them. Boot prints. Clear, fresh prints, not mine, scattered around the perimeter of my RV. They trailed off into the dense woods, leading toward a deeper, unmarked part of the forest. I felt a chill as I crouched down to inspect them. There was no one else camping out this far. The ranger had even commented on how empty the area was. But these prints weren't from his shoes. They were different, smaller, too fresh to ignore. They seemed to lead in a straight line from the edge of my campsite, straight to the fire ring where they stopped, as if whoever left them had stood there, watching. Maybe I wasn't alone. I thought of the ranger's warning, but brushed it off, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. I decided to take a few photos for my blog and follow the trail for a short while. Maybe it was another camper who'd gone wandering and gotten lost. I could help if someone was out here unprepared. As I followed the prints, though, the feeling of being watched intensified. The trees were closing in, the fog thicker, and I had to stop every few steps to keep my bearings. The path was steep and rough, twisting through tangled underbrush that clawed at my legs and arms. I didn't get far before I heard a faint, hollow whistle, a sharp, drawn-out note that made the hair on my neck stand up. It was a sound I recognized, a ranger's distress signal meant to draw attention to a problem. But there was no one else out here, no rangers patrolling, and I'd only gone a mile or so from the RV. The sound came again, closer this time, as if urging me to follow. The temptation was strong, but something deep within me screamed to turn back. I was being watched. I could feel it. I spun around and headed back to camp, pushing away the growing feeling that I was being stalked. By the time I reached my RV, my chest was tight, and I was practically jogging. The prints were still there, trailing in a slow, measured path from the forest's edge, circling the fire pit once and then doubling back into the woods. When night fell, I stayed close to the RV, my mind still churning over the boot prints. The campfire cast shadows over the trees, making them shift and dance in ways that only heightened my unease. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just isolation playing tricks on my mind. I'd spent countless nights alone in the wilderness before, but tonight felt different, like there was something here that hadn't been before. Around midnight, just as I was about to go inside, I saw it. A figure, standing still among the trees, just outside the reach of the firelight. It was tall, motionless, its outline barely visible through the mist. My heart froze. I blinked, and the figure seemed to melt back into the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding, and shined it toward the spot, but there was nothing there. Just empty space and the quiet rustling of leaves. My mind reeled, and I told myself it was a trick of the light. A shadow, nothing more. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I backed up to the RV, locking the door and staying close to the window, eyes fixed on the tree line where I'd seen the figure. Minutes passed, and the forest was silent again. But every few minutes, I thought I saw something shifting between the trees, always just at the edge of my sight, always watching. I barely slept that night, jerking awake at every small noise, every creak or rustle outside. When morning finally came, I felt hollowed out, exhausted, but determined to figure out what was stalking me. I set up my camera outside the RV aimed at the woods, hoping to catch whatever was lurking out there. Hours passed without anything unusual, and I started to feel like maybe I'd imagined it all. But then, as the sun began to set, I replayed the footage and felt a chill run down my spine. There, at the edge of the frame, a figure was standing, almost blending in with the trees. Its face was pale, shadowed, and I could make out sunken, hollow eyes staring directly at the camera before the figure slowly faded back into the trees. I rewound the footage, heart pounding, but each time I played it back, the figure was there, watching, waiting. That night, I stayed inside the RV, every nerve on edge, my eyes darting to the windows at every sound. Outside, the fire had burned low, casting long, thin shadows across the ground, and in the distance, the low whistle echoed once again. I wasn't alone. I tried to stay calm, but the hours dragged on, each tick of the clock amplifying my anxiety. Around midnight, a knock sounded on the side of the RV. Just a single, solid knock, followed by silence. I held my breath, my hand gripping the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as I started to relax, the knock came again, louder this time, right by the door. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the door, half expecting the figure from the footage to be staring back at me. But there was nothing there, only the empty night. I felt my chest tighten as I struggled to stay calm, my hands shaking. The knock came again, harder this time, like something demanding to be let in. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice rough with fear. For a moment, there was silence. Then the low, eerie whistle sounded once more, closer than ever, sending chills down my spine. I didn't move, afraid that any sound would provoke whatever was out there. Slowly, I moved to the window and peeked out, my eyes scanning the darkness. The figure was standing at the edge of the firelight, its gaunt face illuminated in a pale, sickly glow. Its eyes were fixed on me, hollow and dark, and I could see the faint trace of a smile playing on its lips. It tilted its head, watching me with a cold, calculating gaze. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the driver's seat, fumbling as I tried to start the engine. My heart was racing, panic clawing at my mind. The engine sputtered, stalled, then finally roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the mountain road, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. In the rearview mirror, the firelight flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw the figure standing in the road, watching me as I drove away. It took hours to calm down, but I couldn't get the image of that figure out of my head. I reviewed the footage once I was back home, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, that I'd been imagining things. But the footage told a different story. Each frame showed the figure in different spots, always watching, moving closer with each appearance until it was standing right outside the RV. I posted the story on my blog, half hoping someone else had seen something similar. I wasn't sure what to believe anymore, but as the messages started rolling in, my heart sank. I wasn't the only one who had seen the Watcher in those woods. Now, even in the safety of my home, I sometimes feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows, and every so often, just before I drift off to sleep, I hear that low, eerie whistle drifting in through my window, like an invitation to come back. I won't, not ever,